The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
Hi there, and welcome to the Cipher Brief studio. I'm Suzanne Kelly here with Brad Christian. It's always nice to have you back here with us. I am really looking forward to today's expert-led briefing because while we all know by now that private sector companies are on the front lines of the cyber war, we don't often get the insights about what they're seeing and what trends they're picking up on, because those usually don't translate well in traditional media. Particularly though, with the escalation of tensions in Ukraine and Ukraine's history of being something of an unwitting recipient and testing center, if you will, for Russian cyber operations, the information that is gathered and shared by these private sector companies that don't have to go through the same classification hoops as the government does is really more important than ever. Just this week, my colleagues Ella Nakashima and Alex Horton over at the Washington Post reported that Russian government hackers have likely penetrated Ukrainian military and energy networks already, and that they're positioning themselves to attack those networks if they want to, something that analysts believe would be a first step in a potential invasion of Ukraine. Also, the FBI, the NSA, and CISA today are warning US cleared defense contractors to prepare for Russian cyber attacks. That's according to a Reuters story that was just published. It's pretty obvious that in the big picture, we are now living in a constant state of competition in the cyber domain, an age where really there are no more secrets. So how should the government and business be thinking about cyber intelligence in this post-secrecy era? I'm looking forward to welcoming Sandra Joyce in just a moment to talk about that. But first, let's get some logistics out of the way. I'd like to welcome my media colleagues onto today's call. It's a pleasure always to have you here with us. We know how busy you are. Today's briefing rather isn't on the record briefing. We also have a number of Cipher Brief experts and former directors of intelligence agencies on the call today. Thank you for being here with us as well. We invite you to send your questions at any time using that chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And actually, that's how anyone can ask a question. You don't necessarily have to wait at any particular point during today's hour-long briefing. You can send those questions in anytime using that chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Or if you're on your phone, it might be easier. You can always email them to Brad at bchristian@thecipherbrief.com. I'd like to thank Mandiant for their sponsorship of today's session as well. If you're interested in following in Mandiant's lead to help us better understand today's cyber threats, please contact Erica Hipkins at ehipkins@thecipherbrief.com. As Executive Vice President for Global Intelligence and Advanced Practices at Mandiant, Sandra Joyce oversees intelligence collection, research, analysis, and support services for threat intelligence customers and the Mandiant security product portfolio. Now, Sandra has held positions in product management, business development, and intelligence research over the course of 23 years in both national security and commercial industry. Sandra, welcome. It's so nice to see you again.
So great being here. Thanks so much.
You know, I thought I'd ask you off the top to give us a top-level brief, if you will, on what you're seeing from the private sector perspective. So I'd like to turn everything over to you, and I'm going to come back on camera when you're finished, sort of giving us those insights to get into some good Q&A. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. So, I'll start off just by saying that really the main theses that I'm working under here is that the cyber domain has now become a shared mission space. And what that means is that it's no longer just in the hands or the purview of governments. The cyber domain, because of the nature of the internet, it creates this space where threat actors are now acting in the open places, where you don't require a lot of national assets to monitor, interpret, and publish and analyze what is going on out there. It really enables sort of this effects-based approach. So it doesn't have to just be about the sophistication, but it really is a tool so that threat actors, adversaries, both nation state and criminal, can really gain effects even when they don't have a lot of resources. It's that equalizer, that asymmetric capability. And because commercial intelligence organizations like the one that I run have visibility into these spaces, we can open the aperture of, previously areas where only the government knew about. So sometimes it's easy to think about where we are by thinking about where we were before. And so let me take you back to maybe 1999. I was at Goodfellow Air Force Base intelligence school for the Air Force. And what I learned there, the values that we learned, they're so important. Protect your sources, protect your methods, and classified equaled important. Classified meant that things were of value, and we continue to protect them at all costs. But something happened along the way, especially in the area of cybersecurity. Something happened where all of a sudden the information started to become available to not just governments. I remember supporting a government agency as a commercial contractor where they wanted to know about what was going on in the internet. And so what we did was that we were able to look on the internet for them, burn it onto a CD, label it secret, pouch it, carefully take it over to the agency so that they could see what it was. And if you could even just imagine what that looks like today, it's so different. But back then it was spy versus spy, where most things that weren't even known until they were declassified. But the internet, the pace of technology, everything changes, information's ubiquitous. And now the game is less in government hands. And now what we're seeing is that we are in the shared mission space, and most of us are still trying to grapple with the role of what that means. There was an inflection point, a couple of inflection points where I think things really started to change and started to grow out differently. So the first one, back in 2013, the APT-1 report. And what was that? It was when Mandiant finally decided they were going to call out the Chinese government, specifically a PLA unit 61398, that was really pillaging intellectual property from the United States. What that did at that time, it doesn't seem so revolutionary now, but at the time that simply was something that wasn't done. And what it proved was that the private sector had unique insights, that they could actually track, identify, and even mitigate some of the effects of Chinese activities that were trying to hide from the public view. Other cases also followed where private sector started to have really good insights, and some of them are really worth repeating now, especially in the context of Ukraine. So back in 2015 and 2016, when the Russian GRU unit Sandworm started to turn off the lights in Ukraine, we were watching how trends in destructive attacks are really going to this race to the bottom model between ICS, threat actors, and defenders. And when I say race to the bottom, what that means is it's the tendency for attackers to move their exploits one layer down as soon as security controls are introduced at some layer of computer architecture abstraction. So for example, in 2015, the attack on the Ukraine power grid, the attackers leveraged these unauthorized access to the human-machine interface, and they were able to open the breakers and de-energize the substations. So it wasn't that complicated back then. It was really just the same methods they were using for espionage as what they used to gain access. And they got in, they started turning off the lights, they blocked the phone lines with DDoS so that nobody could call for help. There was a video that was done. The psychological impact was very, very formidable back then. So fast forward another year, 2016, an attack on the Ukraine power grid achieved the same goal, except one layer down. So in this industrial protocol layer, this time they brought malware built to provide visibility into their control network traffic. But it is actually really difficult to get, to get visibility at this layer. So what is all this proving? It proved that adversary governments are going to target critical infrastructure with cyber in order not just to have the effect of turning on and off lights, but they're going to do it in a systematic way to punish, to show power, to be able to undermine the confidence in those systems. And so go another year, and an even more advanced attack in 2017, the Triton attack was an attack on the safety systems of an oil and gas facility in the Middle East. The attacker moved their exploit all the way down to the control equipment. This is that regulatory control level, and exploits at this level are often not even challenged by defenders because it is so difficult to see there. So typically they lack any on-device exploitation mitigation. There's really no commercial solution that I know to detect at that level. And what happened was they accidentally shut down the whole plant while deploying the malware. And this caused an unintentional outage. And even though it was unintentional, it was incredibly reckless. So how did Mandiant know about this? Why would a commercial company have this insight? We responded to an incident response. Now, does that mean that a government doesn't have the capacity to do that? It doesn't mean that at all. What happened was that sometimes governments don't have either the prioritization for a specific target, or it's a time and place incident where they simply didn't have jurisdiction, or it wasn't an incident where they wanted to apply national assets to that problem. We were able to track this threat actor through open sources to the Research Institute of Chemistry and Mechanics outside of Moscow. And in that, we really saw how this proved that the private sector, they can really track and identify destructive targets outside the purview of most national governments. So what we're seeing is this shift where government can benefit from commercial intelligence organizations because that aperture continues to be open. And if you fast forward then to SolarWinds, where we're definitely directly affected by that, it really it proved that governments are going to target private cyber intelligence in this space so that they can gain insights and into our ability to track and counter their operations. So what we're seeing is this shift to, it's not spy versus spy anymore, it's spy versus everybody. Because commercial companies are in this space, individual researchers are in this space and have become targets because of the insights that they have and because of the broad view that they are going after. So it means that if you're tracking espionage in this space, if you're tracking the cyber threat, and you're not looking at the commercial sector, you're missing a huge piece of what's going on. So what's happening today? Today, what we can see is really the things that we're struggling with, the things that we're responding to mostly in Mandiant is definitely ransomware on the one end. And we've seen this evolution of ransomware. It was in sort of a nuanced issue. It was something that disrupted businesses, but really what happened when it became a national security issue was around the activities, I believe, around the inflection point was the Colonial Pipeline incident. Another place where Mandiant did an incident response. And we're watching that really from the inside, because what we ended up doing was looking at dark side ransomware gang from the inside by getting ourselves recruited. Now, how did we do that? Well, we run thousands of personas in the underground, and we were able to get recruited. And my view is that we were able to get recruited because we have folks who can speak perfect Russian. They were able to get inside and understand how the entire framework works in ransomware. We were able to see the control panel that these malware family affiliates are given, the sliding pay scale that they are given, and the more that they can ask for in ransomware, the higher the amount, the more the individual can get paid. So this entire business model around ransomware has taken it from just, locking up somebody's pictures all the way to major business disruption and even multifaceted extortion. We're watching threat actors ask about, threaten to give competitors information about the private ongoings of a commercial firm. We're watching them probe and understand a lot of the intellectual property and then spill it or contact the press. So this multifaceted extortion, we've watched it sort of evolve, and it is our view that in the future there may not even need to be malware may not even need to be deployed. They may go straight to extortion because it has been such a lucrative enterprise. So the attack on Colonial Pipeline really that showed us that ransomware is really this entrenched challenge. We're going to be struggling for a long time to stay above water. And more about what we're seeing is really how can commercial intelligence provide early warning as well, because in some cases that is where we can provide a lot of value. In 2020, we saw ransomware operators attack healthcare facilities in the middle of the pandemic. And they did this because of the sense of urgency that hospitals have to pay. In late 2020, at the height of this, we released a major warning about a ransomware threat actor that was targeting these hospitals. And CISA was able to release also a warning that went a lot broader and was able to get the scale of this message out there. At the time, I can tell you that we got some criticism about being alarmist, but our intelligence was based on what we were seeing in the criminal underground. And recent public disclosures, they really allowed us to publicly confirm this, because what we were seeing in the underground was that they had planned to target 428 hospitals, and in private chats, they indicated that they were going to start a panic. And so what we're seeing is that this type of success wouldn't have happened without collaboration from private security companies who have visibility into these networks. But without CISA, this never would have happened, to be able to push out a major warning at that scale, and then have the hospitals who are willing to take action, because that's not always the case. We've done over 2,600 victim notifications just last year. And sometimes when we are trying to let somebody know that they have a problem, or they're on a target list, or that there has been chatter in the underground about them being a victim, some of them find it so hard to believe or don't do anything. And within a couple of days, we've seen something go forward. And that is particularly painful to watch. So, with that, Suzanne, I can tell you a little bit about, everybody's really focused on Ukraine right now. It's the major focus. Why don't I jump into some of that right now? This escalation, it really underscores this need for public-private communication and partnership. So as it's heating up, I think, really I'm concerned about two major disruptive scenarios. The first one, actors burrow into critical infrastructure, or they are already there, and they carry out disruptions to major resources. Secondarily, attackers may use the supply chain to attack or to deploy destructive tools against broad scopes of targets. In either case, whether it's the supply chain or whether it's critical infrastructure, that's really going to be the battleground. And the uniqueness of our times is that battleground is not going to be, within the control and scope of government alone. It's going to be played out publicly, and it's going to be played out in the cyber domain in some cases, where commercial companies, individuals, and others have and may have some of the best views into this, or might be able to provide early warning into that. There are probably the days of hiding behind sources and methods when it comes to classifications. A lot of that is complicating and slowing down some of the work that needs to be done. But what I've been encouraged by is some of the progress in this area, much faster attribution work, much more public. The innovative and great leadership we're seeing from CISA under Director Easterly are just some of the ways that things in this realm are definitely improving. So I'm happy to take any questions about Mandiant's the work, how we do things in our side, what we're seeing in Ukraine. And over to you, Suzanne. Thank you for the time.
Sandra, this is fascinating. I have so many questions. You mentioned some off the top, which is, and we have an excellent piece in today's Cipher brief on this very topic about the declassification of information that normally was held only by intelligence agencies when it comes to what's happening right now in Ukraine. We've seen a number of declassification and information shared broadly with the press in an attempt to sort of ward off what might be Russian activities when it comes to Ukraine. I'm wondering, when it comes to that issue, how much faster and easier is it for the private sector to share information as they get it? Because one of the biggest criticisms of government when it comes to cyber is that they're so slow. There's so many levels of classification, they can't always share. This is a struggle that CISA has quite frequently, and they're taking some interesting steps to address it. But how big of a deal is that?
Well, it was a bigger deal before. I think that they're actually, I'm encouraged by some of the progress that's being made, especially with the JCDC and other places, but even just the mechanics of it. it's not a fair comparison to say, well, this small commercial company can put this information out there, and then compare it to the sprawling bureaucracy of the U.S. government, and with its huge attack surface and all of the implications and sensitivities and diplomatic repercussions that are tied to every word that is said by a government official. I mean, they're apples and oranges, really. So it's certainly easier for a commercial company to share intelligence. It is a whole different ballgame for the U.S. government to consolidate around an issue and a message. And I would imagine that's a challenge even to this day. But I have also seen the speed at which you're talking about that intelligence has been declassified in this recent event. And we will see, time will tell, but the impact, I think, is going to be very clear. A lot of this has, we'll see if it has actually changed the direction or the decision-making rubric of Putin and what he's going to be doing.
I think what we're seeing unfold right in front of us is a picture of the future. Just things are falling into place in a way that I think people who are paying close attention to how cyber information is being gathered and shared and then disclosed are really painting a picture of the future. A question here from Brad, who says, you talked about how commercial intelligence can provide value by early warning. Can you talk more about how fast you need to move in order to provide adequate early warning, and how you go about deciding, Sandra, when it rises to the level of requiring notification? Do you think either the government or private sector has a realistic perspective on the pace of the threats?
Well, that's a great question. So it really depends on the nature of the threat, how much time you have, let's say. We have seen that there typically is about a day or two, or average time where once you have access to a network and then ransomware is deployed. Now that window is shortening. We watched that turn into hours, in some cases even less. It might have something to do with the fact that a lot of the way that ransomware is deployed is that you have different elements that are actually, doing different steps. So, for example, you will see in the underground how threat actors will advertise access, and they will sell access to a network, and then somebody else will pick that up, will deploy the ransomware, or somebody else will be taking care of the lateral movement piece. These are individuals or groups that don't necessarily have any connection other than that they're working on the same target set. But so how fast, we've seen, willingness on the part of victims to act incredibly quickly, and we've seen, a huge slowdown that is incredibly frustrating to see. So I do think it depends on the nature of the threat itself, what's being deployed, how cleanly it's being deployed, and then is the target organization dangling a lot of low-hanging fruit. It is so crucial to do what we can to impose that cost and slow them down. And in those ways, I think that you'll see either a longer period before the malware is deployed, or at the very least, more indicators, because you have blocking and detecting mechanisms in place.
Larry Cipher, who of course is former agency and is now running the Michael Hayden Center for Intelligence over at George Mason, has a question for you. He says, what role, if any, should the commercial sector play in offensive operations or in more disruptive defense?
That is something that I think, in my view, belongs in the hands of governments. And the reason is because of the monopoly of force that creates, the whole framework of which we operate in our international space of nation states. And if we hand over the keys to anybody or in a commercial space who wants to carry out some offensive tactic, we really could lose track and lose the thread on what kind of message we're actually trying to put across. A lot of times, if our government has decided that it's time to use force, and they've decided that cyber is the means by which they were going to carry out that act of force, there are so many implications for that. There's a diplomatic piece, a military piece, having to manage that there would be, a commercial entity that wants to take matters into their own hands. I see that as just chaos, right? I see that as having, I think in the past I've called it, well-intentioned rookies would probably create more problems than it's worth. I think that belongs in the hands of government.
Kind of the Wild West mentality. Edmundo has a question. He says, how do we address the issues created by zero-day bugs, which are being hoarded by government agencies, he says, some which are leaked, including how to weaponize them? What about that issue?
I can appreciate that, but I will say that of the ransomware that we have actually detected, and about a third of it are using 0 days. So I wouldn't say that they're being hoarded by governments. I don't know about that, but what I can say is that plenty of criminals are using 0 days and are using them very effectively, and we're seeing that go on. So I think that as we go forward, we really I think that what's important is to be able to understand the threat landscape, to understand your own threat profile, and to not make sort of assumptions about what your target profile is. Most people don't have to worry about 0 days unless they're really coming face to face with a criminal. I think that that's the kind of thing where nation states are going to use it primarily for espionage, and then the onset of criminals who are using it to deploy ransomware.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, you wrote a great piece that we're going to feature in the Cyber Initiatives group and the Cipher brief tomorrow, but you said the US and Europe have seen wave after wave of attempts to burrow into our, meaning the US, sensitive critical infrastructure, attempts we believe were designed to prepare for a scenario such as the crisis that is unfolding in Ukraine today. Without a doubt, the threat they pose is serious. How big of a threat is US critical infrastructure facing right now, and who are the biggest threat actors behind that risk?
Well, we should think about what it takes to do defense for a second. So in order to do good defense in cyber, it is very difficult to do that without having some kind of staging or some kind of forward presence. I think that just the nature of that is clear to many. So just because a threat actor is positioning, staging, or infiltrating critical infrastructure, it doesn't mean that an attack is imminent. What it means is that they are also trying to do the work of laying a foundation so that they have options. They have strategic optionality if and when they decide that they're going to take action. And so I think that that's the way to look at it is we have seen, a group called Temp Isotope. We have seen them be very interested in critical infrastructure in the United States over the years. And what we believe they're doing is actually creating that strategic optionality so that at some point, if they decide that that is a tactic they want to use, they will be able to do that at that point.
It's obviously a big risk, but it's important, I think, for people, it's a risk for an actor to actually act on that. However, it's important to kind of get a basic understanding out to everyone of what's going on. A question here from Matthew Rumsey. Do we need to enable a better incentive structure to enhance public-private cooperation? This is something we talked about a lot, Sandra. Public record and disclosure does not necessarily align with the goals or desires of company management, even if it's detrimental towards the bigger picture, he says. What do you think about that whole public-private, and how can we create a better relationship there?
Well, I think that what we have seen, especially by groups like CISA and even to some extent the FBI, is that there is definitely a willingness to help with, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure intrusions. So in that way, I think that the public-private partnership is definitely getting better. There are more mechanisms now. There are there are regulations about where the intake will be if a member of the critical infrastructure community is breached. Things like that that sort of streamline that process are definitely getting better and making headway. I think that's the key. The other is that we need to set good examples, right, for what to do if you are breached. In the case of our incident at Mandiant, I can tell you that our CEO is presented with every option available, every legal option. And in some cases, he was told that it may not even reach the threshold for him having to disclose. But I was really, in that moment, I was never been prouder to work for Mandiant when, Kevin Mandia, our CEO, said that trust is the currency by which, we trade in this industry, and we need to do the right thing here. And he decided to not only go public before we even knew who the threat actor was. I mean, we had our suspicions, but we didn't know. But also to put detection tools out for our own red team, tools. So detections for our own red team. So, there are ways to do it right. And I think that over time, as we see more and more good stories and good outcomes of being forthcoming, of reaching out to CISA, to FBI, to those groups, the more good stories that we see, I think people are going to start to understand that, we only serve the adversary by keeping these things private in most cases.
I do think, in all fairness, that Mandiant's kind of been on the leading edge, and Kevin in particular, of changing the way that we think about cyber threats. And you mentioned during your comments off the top about that 2013 attack, and Mandiant had worked with, I believe it was the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken, to publicly identify a building where attacks were coming from in China, which was at the time unheard of, both from sort of the journalism perspective and then, of course, like the private sector perspective. And then the SolarWinds attack, which you were just referring to, I think everybody on this call remembers clearly that it was FireEye, when Mandiant was part of FireEye, that had first disclosed that had occurred. And again, it was an incredible sort of willingness to buck normal trends and do what people expect and not go public. So I'm kind of looking at Mandiant as a pioneering the way toward the future and how we need to think about these things. So on that note, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about where you see the current trends headed and how we need to start to think differently, not only about the threats themselves, but about how private companies and governments are responding to the threats and how they're sort of contextualizing what this means in the future?
Well, I think that what we are seeing is a willingness just drawn out from sheer exhaustion. So what I mean by that is it's been attack after attack after attack, and these are getting bigger and they're costing more, and the impact on defenders has been such that there just has come a point where we want to do something different. It is not serving us well to not disclose. It's not serving us well to panic, right? To go and to hide from these threats, right? I think that where the industry is going is an acceptance that we can do a lot of work on the front end. We can do a lot to remediate, and we can make a difference to make something a small incident or a big incident. And that the right thing to do is to make sure that we don't hide the tactics, techniques, and procedures that were used in our own attack from everybody else, because collective defense is the only thing that's going to work. And I think that hoarding that information is proven to be not helpful. And in that, we may have been getting to these conclusions just based on so many defeats, but we're getting there. And I think that's the important thing. I think there is a willingness now to disclose, because they've seen so many people do it, and so many people continue to thrive in their business afterwards. So it's survivable, it's not insurmountable, and that's becoming the norm.
Yeah, it's really a way of facing that fear of letting anyone know that you're a victim of an attack. It's
Right.
Even though we've known for years, it's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when. But Sandra, let's come back to the headlines for just a minute and talk about Ukraine. You joined us for last week's Cyber Initiatives group and had some excellent tips on ransomware, which I want to talk about in just a minute. But first, when it comes to Ukraine, I think it's pretty clear that what happens in Ukraine on the cyber level won't necessarily stay in Ukraine. And I'm wondering what advice you're giving your corporate clients on what to look out for if there is either a cyber escalation in the lead up, which who knows? I mean, we're seeing all sorts of indicators that there could be, or if there's actually a Russian invasion of Ukraine. What should companies and businesses be looking for? Because sometimes these attackers would use other attacks as distractions, right?
Right. So high level, I would say that, it's really what I put in my blog. It is to understand that these attacks, that if they happen, remember that this is, I think that the trigger points for some kind of cyber activity probably is in the realm of if sanctions are deployed. I don't think the United States is the major kinetic target here. I don't think that the United States is the cyber target. I think that it will, that Russia will be prompted to, or will see a provocation when and if we are to deploy those sanctions that the Biden administration has been talking about. So once the consequences are put on the Russian government for these actions, I think that's when we get into a really high risk time. And so high level, it's not to panic, not to overblow it, to realize that these things have happened and we have survived them and we can mitigate them. And that is the work that we do every day. It's not a panic moment, it's a mission moment. Now, tactically, the way to think about it is, first understand where you are in the system of systems. Are you a target? Do you satisfy collection requirement for the Russian government? Are you part of critical infrastructure? Are you part of what is in that framework? Because this is as opposed to a criminal incident where most everybody is a target. With the Russian cyber threat, it's really, are you part of a collection requirement, or is your are you part of critical infrastructure or can make an effect that they're looking for? And then it's really a matter of taking those threat actors themselves very tactically. We know which threat actors carry out which types of attacks. We understand their techniques, and it's looking to build detections and blocking around that, doing the basics on best practices. I think that in that way, we can at least slow it down. We can mitigate, do your tabletop exercises and understand, when and if it happens, how you're going to respond. And we need to be resilient, because we simply cannot live in fear over this, because our perceptions are the target as well. A lot of what Russia has done in the past is try to give the illusion of parity. Even though it is a declining economy, it's trying to give the illusion of parity with other superpowers. And through these methods, through spreading this fear, we're doing the work for them if we're not careful about how we're presenting that threat.
You talked about ransomware during last week's Cyber Initiatives group, and Kevin Mandiant, your CEO, has said before to the Cipher brief and the SIG that ransomware is like more outrageous than it's ever been. I think he said the Russians are very, very good at this. Is it likely, in your estimation, that there would be an increase in ransomware attacks if sanctions were applied against Russia? Or is it detached?
It is certainly a tactic we would expect to see. But let's remember some of the things that they have done in the past. Ransomware, that's, it's actually a destructive malware masquerading as ransomware, as in NotPetya. So let's think about not just the effect of whether or not it could be ransomware. That's surely a tool of the trade, but sometimes it doesn't even need to be that sophisticated. I mean, when we look at some of the DDoS operations that are targeting Ukrainian banks right now, what I find fascinating is not the DDoS attack itself, but it's the SMS spam that's been going out saying your bank doesn't work. That's the interesting part to me. That's the part that's, to me, speaks volumes about what the Russian approach is to the cyber game. It's not just the sophistication level of the attack itself. It is, how can I get into the mind of my target? How can I change behaviors without firing a shot? It's effects-based work, and that is what they have been, very good at in the past.
Very good. Another question here. You said earlier that it's now spy versus everybody, which I think is a great way to think about this. Should more be done to bring that message to all of society, encourage private sector leaders to think perhaps more like combatants instead of victims, given that offensive cyber needs to stay with government?
I think we do need to upgrade the ability that we have to defend. I think that we definitely need to be teaching that at a much younger age. I am encouraged when I talk to my colleagues about what they're doing to prepare for a cyber attack. I am very discouraged when I talk to friends and family that are not in the cyber domain or not in the cyber world, because these things continue to just go straight over their head, and that is discouraging. Enough has happened to disrupt daily life for individuals. I think that we should try to make this more of a priority in the way that we educate, the way we talk about it. Some of the advisories that have been coming out of Department of Homeland Security through CISA have been incredibly accessible, but also with really meaty advice and steps to take. And I think that that's the type of information sharing that is going to be really helpful as we try to educate this next generation into what has become, the real battlefield of the future.
What are some of the indicators that you're going to be personally looking for that might mean there's going to be an increase in cyber activity emanating from Russia?
Well, one thing that we pay attention to a lot is the information sphere. So a lot of the ways that you soften a target is through the psychological component. And we have seen a group that we call, that employs the Ghostwriter campaign. That's an information and influence operations group that we've tracked for a while now. We are watching groups like that to see if they're going to be putting out narratives that are going to either create that the cause for war excuse, or to be able to shift the narrative to put out and create a win, let's say, in the perception of the world. And so I think that those are some of the indicators that we would be looking for. Another one would be looking at if it's not even in a kinetic invasion, what we would be looking for is disruption of the economy. Some of those things have already, started to sort of show themselves now through trying to DDoS the banks, looking at some of the wiper malware that has been going to government entities in Ukraine. All of those things are putting us on high alert. And we expect to see if there is going to be some type of kinetic invasion. We would expect to see that to continue. But I would say, and I would caution that I think that for in terms of U.S. targets and targets in the West, I think that that's where we're really going to see a lot of the cyber impact as well, if this moves forward the way that some believe that it will.
What are you most worried about?
Well, I think it goes back to something at scale. So a wormable exploit or a destructive attack. I mean, something along the lines of SolarWinds, but with a destructive angle. I think that we haven't seen that, and that would be, let's call it the one of the worst case scenarios in cyber. And even by saying that would be destructive, that would be a great tragedy if that were to happen. But it's, I think one thing to think about is that by far more death and destruction has come from real kinetic war than has ever been deployed in the cyber domain. And that is not to downplay the cyber risks. That is not to downplay the horrendous outcomes that cyber attacks put on victims and their families and the businesses. But it is sort of a, let's make sure that we step back, that the number one priority here for Russia is, the manufactured crisis, right? It's the domestic, support for Putin's regime. It's pieces that are not about making, kinetic effects in the United States. And we see that message kind of mix or kind of get conflated in some of the rhetoric around this. And I just think we need to be clear about that.
I wonder too, we have a question here from someone who very much wants to know how important your past military experience and training is to your current role. But I just want to build on that based on what you just said, because Ukraine is really the first situation where I think we're kind of seeing the art of what's possible when it comes to the new kind of warfare, where it is cyber related and kinetic. We haven't really experienced something like this that's captured global attention in the way that this particular crisis has. So I do want to kind of piggyback on that question about your military career and experience. And is that sort of shaping the way that you're thinking about what's happening both today in Ukraine and then the future of what war might look like?
Well, it certainly is. It certainly shapes that. I'm speaking as a Mandiant executive today, right? And I can't speak for on behalf of the Air Force, but I can. The elements of warfare, let's say, the elements that build on what we would see in terms of preparation of the battle space. I think those things are really important as a framework when we look at what's happening now. We look for indications of warnings. We look for early warning. when we're thinking about how things can play out, most dangerous, most likely. So certainly there are underpinnings of that type of background in all of the work that we do, because it is the crossover. Cybersecurity is the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and people, and we stand right in the middle of that when we're doing cybersecurity work.
So how do you think people can best be prepared in the future? And when I say people, I really mean down to the individual level of people who are just kind of waking up to understanding how cyber impacts their own lives. The businesses that are really the backbone of the US economy that are now getting pulled into these wider geopolitical situations. What's the best way to sort of reach everyone with a better understanding of not only the threats, but what it means to them?
I think that what we need to think about, it's very hard to get the average person who is trying to get their kids to school, put dinner on the table, sit in traffic. It is a challenge, let's say, to then ask them to understand these, principles of jus ad bellum and everything, and understand, what's going on in the cybersecurity landscape. But I think that the way to sell it is that, unlike any other time in history, individuals are targets as well. Whether we're talking about the information space or the data that's collected on you in huge amounts to fund the research in another country, elements of privacy, elements of autonomy and agency that can be stripped after a cyber incident. I think that can make it very personal. And from there, you can then begin to talk about, well, this is also the tools of the trade when we're talking about the balance of power in the world. And, maybe that's not what the average American wants to think about, but I think it's so important because, look, one of the biggest differentiators we have over our adversaries, and one of the biggest powers that we have is our technological position. So our technology has long been the thing that enabled us to have this advantage in the battle space. If we are not, defending against the theft of our intellectual property, if we are not defending against ransomware that's stripping us of billions of dollars, if we are not defending on that front, it is going to erode that technological advantage. It's going to erode that economic advantage that we hold. And over time, no, this is not how America goes down, but over time, it certainly can erode our position diplomatically, militarily, economically. We should all care about that.
I remember back a decade ago when I was covering this up on the Hill and all sort of looking at legislation and the crying and the screaming by senators and representatives about the loss of intellectual property and how much that was costing the US. How much of an issue is the theft of IP still for US-based companies and organizations?
Well, it certainly is an issue. I would say that we're not seeing it at the levels that we saw it before the Obama-Xi agreement, but it is certainly continues to be an issue. And it is not just, the United States. We can also think about the intellectual property theft that's happening around the world. And we can recall that the Obama-Xi agreement was very narrowly written to only look at dual use, and it does not account, or outside of dual use, which means that there's still a lot of intellectual property that is a target. I mean, I can tell you that we're responding to intrusions today where APT 41 or another threat actor is conducting espionage, for various means and for various outcomes, and we're not seeing sort of this cyber activity peaking at any point. This is certainly continues to grow and continues to be a problem. I would say, though, that right now, if you were to pin me down about the thing that is most top of mind for the cybersecurity threats right now, I would have to say ransomware continues to be our number one concern. If you look at what our consultants are responding to, it is often and mostly now looking at ransomware.
And is it the same groups, Sandra, that are perpetrating the ransomware attacks, or are you seeing sort of a proliferation as this becomes more of a community-based cooperation effort to attack, to launch a ransomware attack? How are you seeing that progress?
It's a little bit, and it's helpful to kind of see how these things are organized to answer that question, because affiliates for these ransomware families, they can be recruited by one ransomware operator, but then also recruited by 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 other ones. And so these threat actors, even if this ransomware family is dissolved, is indicted, or something like that, it doesn't mean that that threat goes away, because these individuals who are doing this, they have other options. And so when you think about root cause, it's really about how are we going to go to the root cause of this, looking at these operators in places where they have safe harbor, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, where they're operating out of. The core of it is there. The core of it is, making sure that we can, in some diplomatic way, encourage the disruption of that. For example, some of the recent work that was done, to take down like R-Evil and things like that they're encouraging. However, those groups, they simply go to the next operator, the next malware family, or ransomware family. So it's one thing to chop off the head, but one grows back. So we really need to get at the heart of it.
And then one final question, because I'm very curious to know, and I want to follow up on something you mentioned earlier before I come to you for any closing thoughts, remarks, but the idea of destructive attacks. So ransomware is one thing, but what about when attacks do become more destructive? What is your biggest concern there?
I think Triton was probably I think a magazine called it the most murderous malware out there. And this is why it was a biggest concern, because it was an accident. So it wasn't an accident that there was an intrusion, that they were, in the network trying to manipulate the safety systems, but that there was an element of recklessness in it. And at that point, when you're in the safety systems of an oil and gas facility, when you are toying with those elements that can result in loss of life, that is what concerns me the most, is that these cyber capabilities are really can be weaponized and put into the wrong hands of somebody who doesn't understand. We could see the proliferation of them in a really reckless way. But that being said, we haven't seen a NotPetya type attack in a while, and that is a good thing, and I hope that that continues.
Sort of an insider question here, but you mentioned earlier that Mandiant has thousands of personas that are operating in the underground, and it's really allowed you access to sort of the thinking of a lot of these groups. Is there a sense among the groups themselves of sort of having an established level of professionalism so that you don't get those reckless actors in there who sort of ruin the criminal business for the rest of them?
Like an honor amongst thieves kind of thing. So
exactly.
Yeah, we used to see honor amongst thieves. Like there was a whole thread a few times, a few years ago, about how, anybody who targets a hospital is on the outs. But I would say that now that's not really the case. Even the ransomware families that we're talking about, not targeting, during the pandemic, they weren't going to target hospitals, but some of them still did. Many of them targeted, pharma, because pharma was off limits, or fair game or whatever. So I don't really think anything is beneath some of the threat actors that we've been seeing. We've seen some tremendously reckless things, and some of them don't even know what they are doing. And what I mean by that is they don't even know what kind of entity that they've just, breached. They don't know that it's a hospital, or they might not know what they're doing. And that kind of recklessness, that is hard to forgive.
I think that's probably the scariest, if you ask me, and no offense to teenagers out there, but as the parent of teens, if you don't know what you're doing, sometimes it can really be destructive. Any kind of closing thoughts for us today, Sandra, as we're looking at, what's happening in the world, and there is this particular focus on Ukraine, but a heightened sense of business, of just kind of anxiety in the day-to-day and what might be coming. Any closing thoughts for us?
Well, I think it's not a panic moment, it's a mission moment. We've trained for this. One of the things that, the unlikely outcome of years and years of Russian cyber activity is that they've given us unintentionally a look into their capabilities and their threat actor tactics. So we know a lot, not everything, but we know a lot. The government has mobilized in a way that we have never seen before. The leadership is in a position to do great things. And I think that what we can do is just understand when it comes to the cyber domain that it is an open, shared mission space. And we have that responsibility across commercial individuals and government to defend not just our nation, but our allies, and think about, where we need to protect, because whether or not, there's a lot of rhetoric around, are we going to be the only superpower? Who's going to be the next one? I think it's all about what is the vision for humanity that we want to align ourselves with, and the importance of defending against these threat actors is huge. We cannot do it alone. And in this shared mission space, I think we need to be bold and brave, and looking forward to any more questions from the group. But thank you for having me here.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I think, just given the examples that we've heard from you today, the bold part is something, the brave and bold part is something that Mandiant has certainly demonstrated. Thank you so much for joining us in the Cipher Brief studio for this conversation with Mandiant Executive Vice President Sandra Joyce, and our thanks to Mandiant for their support of allowing us to bring you conversations like this that really give you a peek inside what these private sector companies are seeing, that really are, I think we've said in the past multiple times, these companies are on the front lines of the cyber battle, and we appreciate the insights and you sharing this information with us, Sandra. For our Subscriber Plus members, I want to thank you as well for your support. If you're not yet a Subscriber Plus member, I invite you to upgrade your access by becoming one today at thecipherbrief.com. And be sure to check out our daily brief or the website for upcoming briefings, including Subscriber Plus exclusive briefings. Brad and I will see you back here next tomorrow morning for the Cipher Brief's open source report, where we'll be bringing you the latest headlines on what's happening in Ukraine and other places around the world that are impacting U.S. national security. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.